we go. So, in Arendt, we saw that total domination requires, or in her view, right, that total domination requires eliminating legal protections for people, eliminating moral protections from people, so things that aren't written down in law, right, but that deprive people of moral status, or equal moral status, and then eliminating the unique individual, right? Dehumanism fits very well with that. Dehumanism is typically achieved through propaganda, so I'll talk a little bit about propaganda today. And then this is going to feed into your lesson for next week on extremism. There you're going to look at Qassam. Qassam is someone we've encountered already this semester with epistemic vices and conspiracy theories. And guess what? His view of epistemic vices and conspiracy theories has a role to play in his view of extremism as well. So that's kind of why I picked it. It's because it kind of, you can see how his views of different things kind of fit into a broader perspective, right? So that's the one you're going to be looking at. And by the way, you don't need to worry about the Q&A session at the end of that video. Just watch the where he's given his lecture. They give a little bit of a lengthy introduction as well. You can probably skip over that as well. Just get to his lecture. And so he's going to talk about extremism in a slightly different way, although it will be similar to this account in several respects. And so, keeping in mind our lesson for today and what you've read, extremism refers to the belief that an in-group success can never be separated from the need for hostile action against the out-group. The hostile action must be a part of the in-group's definition of success. Hostile acts can range from verbal attacks and diminishment to discriminatory behavior, violence, and even genocide. This is obviously a very wide spectrum of activity. So he says, what's key, at least to Berger's account of extremism, is not only a division between us and them, which was talked about in your reading for today, but tying the in-group success to the out-group's elimination, basically, or their neutralization at least. So he says that this can occur either in state or non-state actors. We would probably think of some activities of the state in North Korea towards their citizens as rather extreme. And then non-state actors, those are like, like terrorist groups, something like that, right? Or like white nationalists or the Proud Boys, these sorts of things. So non-state actors, right? And so that's Berger's account, and so you can see how totalitarianism, dehumanization, and extremism are going to have some stuff in common here. So again, Qassam's definition will have more aspects to it than just those, so be sure you're kind of thinking about both of those things. So dehumanization. Y'all familiar with Black Mirror? Right, so this is a Black Mirror episode called Men Against Fire. As the author notes, the story follows Stripe, as he comes to realize that the roaches aren't vermin, but rather beings who are being targeted for mass genocide due to their alleged inferior genes. The episode showcases how easy it is to commit acts of violence against groups of persons when they are literally seen as subhumans, non-humans, right? And so kind of three big things here. What do we mean by dehumanization? How do language and propaganda dehumanize? So I'm going to talk a little bit about propaganda more. They mention it several times in the reading, but they don't really go into much detail about what propaganda is, so I thought I'd give some more specific definitions of that kind of thing. And I think it's pretty obvious why dehumanization is important. When you do that to people, we end up doing bad shit to people. Right? So to tie this in with some stuff we've already covered, and now this is from the thinking from the standpoint of normative and prescriptive moral theory. Each of the theories that we covered had some view of moral personhood, right? And as we learned there, it's not just about being a member of a human species. So we're not really talking about human in terms of membership in a biological species. We're talking about it in terms of moral personhood. So that might include non-human animals, right? So each of the theories that we looked at had a different way of thinking about what moral consideration was, or what counts as moral personhood. So again, what we mean there is any being deserving of full moral consideration and status. Sometimes you'll see people talking about as being full members of the moral community, right? And so what I mean by equal moral status is that I don't mean that everybody's actions are all equally good or right. What I mean is, in virtue of the kind of being that they are, they have moral status, right? So that they matter in some respect. And so we saw with utilitarianism, the criteria was just sentience. Any being that had the capacity to experience pleasure and pain, whether it's human pain or non-human pain, is a full member of the moral community. So you get arguments for vegetarianism and veganism off the ground really easy with utilitarianism. In Kantianism and in Aristotle, it was both rational personhood. That's what it has intrinsic value, right? In divine command theory, it's because we're all God's creatures, right? In Locke, that we just covered, it was because we're all rational beings as well, right? So that standard of rationality has always played a big role in lots of theories. Nevertheless, when we look at people's actual moral beliefs and practices, so not thinking about it in terms of what our normative theory is, but looking around the world and seeing how people behave, we see that there are lots and lots of normative claims about hierarchy involved, right? We even encountered this with care ethics when certain character traits were attributed to one gender or sex and others to the other gender or sex, and some were devalued or favorably valued, right? So we see this kind of thing pop up all the time. So James Rachels points out that there are a whole host of moral views, notice he doesn't call them theories there, that have this in common. They all involve dividing people into groups according to race and assigning a greater importance to the interests of some groups that count more than the interest of other groups. So anti-Semitism works the same way, so can nationalism. And then he asks in this article, can such views be defended? And he comes down on the side of no. He says we should reject those sorts of theories because of arbitrariness and because they violate this basic principle, which is pretty well supported by any theory that's going to have these sorts of considerations involved in it about equal moral status, right? So the principle is this. Treat equals equally unless there's some factual difference between them that justifies differential treatment. So normally you get the right of free movement in our society, right? And in lots of societies. What happens if you commit and are found guilty and actually were legitimately found guilty of homicide? You go to jail. There is a factual difference between your behavior that justifies the difference in treatment. Everybody that earns a certain grade in class gets the same grade unless we find out that you cheated, and then you get treated differently because of the difference in behavior there, right? So it always matters equal in what respect and in what way, right? But that's a basic moral principle that seems to be violated from any kind of moral practice or common sense view or unreflective view that involves this hierarchy between things, right? And so in the article they say that, and correctly, I think they say that the way that dehumanism works is through propaganda and language use, the manipulation of those things. So one way of thinking about what dehumanism involves, right, is propaganda eliminating through manipulation senses of beliefs about moral equality, right, in that regard. So they're dehumanizing them, literally taking the moral personhood away from them. And so propaganda, a little bit about that. They mention it through the article, but they don't really give you much of a detailed definition there. Lots of things that we could ask about propaganda philosophically. First, the conceptual question, how should we conceive of it? Second, is propaganda the same as a lie? Is propaganda always bad? Right? We could ask all those sorts of questions about it. And obviously, many of the things that we covered earlier in the semester as informal fallacies that philosophers take pains to avoid in their own arguments are employed intentionally to manipulate in propaganda, right? So a couple different definitions here. I'm going to work more with one than the first two. So the first definition, deliberate, systematic attempt to shape perceptions, manipulate cognitions, and direct behavior to achieve a response that furthers the desired intent of the propagandist. So that's from Propaganda and Persuasion. I think that book's like in its 7th edition now. It's kind of a standard. It's an oft-used textbook on persuasion and propaganda. And then an older study by Dwight Laswell here. This is from the an early study of propaganda in 1937. Propaganda in the broadest sense is the technique of influencing human action by the manipulation of representations. These representations may be spoken, written, pictorial, musical form, or musical in form. So, media, all kinds of media. Here's a more recent study, Stanley, in his book, How Propaganda Works, and he says, the essence of political propaganda on my approach is that it's a kind of speech that fundamentally involves political, economic, aesthetic, or rational ideals mobilized for a political purpose. Propaganda is in the service of either supporting or eroding those ideals. One of the things he says about it is that propaganda, and this is common to all of our definitions, right, is that it's persuasion through non-rational means. So that ought to remind you of sophistry and rhetoric from the very beginning of the semester. Right? So a few more things from Stanley's study before I get to his supporting and eroding, undermining propaganda distinction. So, as I just pointed out, it aims to persuade without engaging reason, but by engaging biases and fallacies and so forth. Effective propaganda conceals the fact that it's propaganda. Right? It's going to try and look like a legit news, outlet, or it may present itself as a form of entertainment. So we might ask, y'all know that movie back, or several years ago when this movie, The Day After Tomorrow with Jake Gyllenhaal, do y'all know that movie? It's about like environmental catastrophe, where all of a sudden there's like these superstorms that make the earth like enter a cold age, right? And people complained about that movie that it was like climate science propaganda, right? So we could ask whether that film is presented as in form of entertainment, whether it's trying to manipulate our messages. We could ask whether Zero Dark 30 is just pro-military propaganda, right? That's the idea. So it's going to conceal in some way that it's propaganda. He notes that that propaganda is itself neutral, but can be put to bad or good use. So that's probably a little bit different than the way many of us just assume to, kind of by default, think about propaganda as inherently bad. Right? So there's a point that he makes that might be contrary to our usual ways, or common sense ways of thinking about propaganda. Then he notes that propaganda need not be false, a lie, or delivered insincerely. He notes that propaganda often presents words as if they are neutral, but connects those neutral phrases to implicit value judgments. They smuggle in a value judgment. So think about how we normally think about conspiracy theory. That's not a neutral. It's not a neutral definition. It's an evaluative definition that dismisses it from the outset, right? So we went through a whole thing with that there. So speaking of that, let's just do a little bit here. There's a fallacy actually called the persuasive definition fallacy. It's also called the definist fallacy. Any of y'all know this? What are three basic types of definitions? Anybody know? Anybody ever heard this before? We've got lexical definitions, precising definitions, and then stipulative definitions. Precising and stipulative definitions are like specific uses in particular contexts. A lexical definition is common usage. Lexical definition, dictionary definition. So common usage defined in terms, defined by other common terms, by reference to other common terms. So a lexical definition, right, is just a dictionary definition. There's usually 2 or 3 listed for every term, right? And those are just common usage terms, right? Lexical lexicographers, they study how common usage in language, right? Precising definitions and stipulative definitions are maybe types of definitions for the same term, but that have particular meanings for a particular context. So a precising definition is going to narrow the meaning of the lexical. So that that term is less open to interpretation by the reader. Here's how a bunch of people screw up in college. They'll get a list of vocabulary words, and then they'll learn the lexical definitions of those vocabulary words, but your teacher is wanting you to understand the precising or stipulative definitions that were used in the reading assignments. Right. So, for example, sometimes people use, it's common usage to sometimes use the word fallacy very generically, just as equals a bad argument. But we gave a specific, more precise definition of fallacy for our use in this class. An error in reasoning other than a false premise. Right? So we were specifying what kind of error it was. Right? A stipulative definition, and so the precising definition will always be consistent with the lexical definition. Logically consistent. But narrower, more specific. The stipulative definition stipulates an altered use for a given context. Often like a special use of the term in the context of an argument or a theory or something like that. So we get dictionary definitions, common usage, more precising definitions for specific cases that are consistent with lexical definitions, stipulative definitions that involve an altered use of the lexical definition and may contradict. The lexical definition. So neutral words and phrases are connected to judgments, attitudes, and biases. If I can get people to believe through use of the defendant's fallacy that my definition of someone includes an evaluation of them, but I present that as a neutral lexical definition, I'm now living rent-free in your head, right? So the defendant's fallacy occurs when a definition, it's a type of it's a type of stipulative definition that presents itself as if it was common usage, but really is formulated in a way to support a particular argument, right? So then if I use that definition in a premise in an argument, now it's going to be a bad argument, right? Make some sense? Right? So he notices that Stanley also points out that social movements need propaganda. And here's the other thing that may be a little shocking to some people, is that both authoritarian and free societies and governments use propaganda. And then he distinguishes. This is kind of one of his big things that he kind of adds to the discussion, I think, is that propaganda is either supporting or eroding of certain ideals. Propaganda will appeal to moral sentiments and moral ideals. And it could be of the kind that supports the realization of those very ideals. Suppose I'm in favor of democracy and I want more people to vote. And so I tell them every election cycle is the most important election in our national history and democracy is at stake, and if you don't vote, it's going to be on you whether we're still a democracy or not. So it's an appeal to fear, right? So I'm trying to scare them into voting, but it's probably going to increase democratic participation, so it's increasing that value, right? On the other hand, we're going to have propaganda that may appeal to some ideal, but actually serves as an obstacle or erodes those very ideals. Right? So if I can get you to buy into a certain idea of what counts as an American, right, or something like that, I'm appealing to patriotic ideals, but you know, if your idea of what a real American is a white nationalist, then I got a problem with your definition of who counts as a real American, right? So that's what's kind of going on there. So it's very easy to see how the fallacies that we learned earlier in the semester serve as propaganda techniques. Again, many of them are just the same techniques that are used in advertising or propaganda. It's just in philosophy we try to avoid them, and in propaganda it's the intentional use of them to manipulate people through representations, right? So I could use an appeal to fear, an appeal to compassion, right, to mobilize people. I could create straw man arguments of people. Dehumanization looks like some weak analogy fallacies are going on there, because what I'm doing is analogizing human beings falsely to non-human insects or bugs, right? Or hasty generalizations. We've got a few, these migrants did bad stuff, so we got to get rid of the migrants, right? Stuff like that. Hasty generalization, all those can be used in various ways as propaganda. And then, of course, the reading article for today says that the main way in which dehumanization is achieved is through propaganda. And so I didn't do this in the reading assignment, so I've got 5 different definitions of dehumanization here. There's only one that was really used in your article, and it's the last one, who they actually quote and appeal to, Smith's book, Less Than Human. Is conceiving of others as subhuman creatures. I'm going to add some more to that too. But the first one is a Kantian notion of dehumanization that Smith actually rejects. He says it doesn't get everything. And it's just basically like objectification, treating people as mere means. So that's Kantian dehumanization. Rhetorical practice that metaphorically liken human beings to non-human animals or inanimate objects. That's closer to Smith's version. The denial of subjectivity, individuality, or distinctively human attributes of others, and then treating others in such a way as to erode, obstruct, or extinguish some of their distinctively human attributes, like rationality or something like that. Get you to act like an automaton. And then, of course, the conception that's used in the article itself by Manning is number 5. So let's flush that out a little bit. I put an excerpt from Smith on Moodle for you. It's actually a link to an excerpt of his book, Less Than Human. And you can find a lot of his lectures on YouTube as well. He's written a couple of books recently. There's actually 3 of them. One of them is Less Than Human that they mentioned in the reading. He wrote a shorter one. It's more like a shorter primer on it, really, called The Inhuman, I think is the name of that one. And his most recent book is like Making Moral Monsters. So he's developed a theory of dehumanization throughout those works. And so here's what he says in Less Than Human. So remember, we talked about moral theory and moral personhood earlier, and then what he's going to talk about here is just our ordinary moral practices and beliefs, so our actual moral psychology, not our moral theory. So he says, but even a cursory examination of all sorts of moral distinctions that come naturally to us shows us that the idea that a normative hierarchy is still very much alive in our moral psychology. So the way in which people actually behave is what he's getting at here. All of us, it seems, attribute different degrees of intrinsic value to different kinds of things. We regard our own kind as having the greatest value and think of animals as having a greater value than plants. We esteem higher animals like primates more than lower animals like invertebrates. I killed a bug with impunity this morning. I did not think twice about it because it's a bug, right? That's exactly what he's saying. Which roll off the tongue so easily, are hierarchical and ultimately normative notions that are inconsistent with the scientific conception of the biosphere. they're also logically inconsistent with the theory, all those theories that justify the equal treatment principle, right? But he's, again, talking about how people actually behave. And so he says, we rank them lower than the human rank, creatures to which we attribute a lower degree of intrinsic value than we attribute to our own kind, and towards which we feel a lesser degree, if any, of moral obligation. Oops, I missed an of there. Then he goes on here. So he says, we dehumanize others when we think of them as having an essence of a subhuman kind. So here's kind of the real key. He's going to say it's a twofold process. It's not just objectification. It involves objectification, but then it also involves attributing a non-human essence to them, an animalistic or insect essence to them. So he says, this suggests that dehumanization consists of two processes. One consists in denying that others have a human essence, whatever that is, rationality, sentience, whatever that is. When this occurs, one thinks of them as non-human, but not as subhuman, a condition corresponding to Mansell's mechanistic dehumanization. I prefer the term objectification. The other process consists in attributing a subhuman essence to them, animalistic dehumanization. So this analysis suggests that dehumanization is more complex than objectification. When we objectify others, we simply deny their humanity. But when we dehumanize them, we both deny their humanity and we attribute a subhuman essence to them. So we got two things going on here. The denial of something and then the positive attribution of a less than human essence to them, a lower ranking moral status, right? And so from the reading, this is likely why the locals, hating the ostracized group, were largely unable to kill them. They still saw them as human beings. Instead, Brooker wanted to emphasize that the villagers didn't need the mask device, the implant in their heads that makes them see them as monsters, a device to see them as roaches, because they wanted them to mirror the audience. People don't need the mass implant, to demonize and hate people. Yet the mass implant allows the military to, quote, do its job by making it so that the soldiers literally perceive human beings as monsters instead. It is this perception of persons as subhumans that makes it so easy to massacre them. So there's why it's important. And then he goes, she goes on. Dehumanization, indeed, one of the first steps towards ostracizing individuals in marginalized groups is to find a means of othering them, to create a sharp division between us and them. The use of dehumanizing language and propaganda is a long-standing method to create this divide. Human beings are likened to distasteful animals like insects or rodents. And so she points out that there are several elements going on here. The division between us and them, it's not merely the use of objectionable language to describe them. It goes further than that. It reinforces trust amongst us and distrust of them. It prioritizes, morally speaking, us over them, and it subordinates or deadens or even eliminates our ability to empathize and have compassion for them, for the other. And so in Nazi Germany propaganda, for example, you saw that kind of thing at work. Here's a movie called The Eternal Jew that was a propaganda film in Nazi Germany. You can see how they've caricatured the Jewish person here to look less than human and more like a monster, right, in the cover of it. So thinking sets the agenda for action, and thinking of humans as less than human paves the way for atrocity. The Nazis were explicit about this in the status of their victims. They were Untermenschen, undermen. That's what they described them, subhumans. And as such were excluded from the system of moral rights and obligations that bind humankind together. It's wrong to kill a person, but permissible to exterminate a rat. So to the Nazis, all the Jews, gypsies, and others were rats, dangerous, disease-carrying rats. So again, we see this division between us and them playing a role in dehumanization, And then we're going to see, as I already pointed out, that same kind of division pop up with extremism here. So we've seen that play a role in the origins of totalitarianism, or not so much the origins of totalitarianism, but what totalitarianism in power does when it tries to eliminate the internal threats and the external undesirables. We get a straight treatment of that here with Black Mirror, and then that's going to pop up again with the extremist lesson. All right, questions about dehumanization? Anybody got anything? All right, so kind of two key things, right? Objectification plus attributing a lower ranking essence to them, a subhuman essence to them, right?